Hey, this is Corey Barnes.
And this is Lisa Caperton, and you're listening to Her Turn to Talk. Previously, we talked about reducing, recycling, and reusing. And making progress. How's your progress going on that?
Oh, big time. I have been, look at my collection of plastic. I have plastic containers that I've been collecting. And so what I'm going to do now is they were from, I ordered one of these mail order food subscriptions, and they all came in this plastic containers. I was thinking, oh my God. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop that subscription, make my own food now that I have new recipes, and use these containers. They can be used as freezing to be put in the freezer or in the refrigerator.
For meal prepping.
And they're great and on the go. I've been doing that. I use plastic straws that are hard plastic that I can use over and over again, and I wash those out. So I've been doing that. I've also been reusing bags, and I always reuse paper bags.
I love it. I did that the other day. I accidentally forgot my tote bags, which I'm trying to make sure I'm doing better at, but I made sure to use paper instead of plastic at the grocery store, and I did not use any of those little plastic bags to put my fruit and vegetables in. I've been trying to really do that. Another thing that you can do with your plastic food containers, you just made me think of that. So like sometimes people get them for other things too, like just things you buy at the grocery store sometimes come in those containers, but you can donate them to the soup kitchen. So at our soup kitchen, we take donations. You can even give them to me for you personally, but and I'll take them in. But we use them as to-go containers for the people for leftover food at the soup kitchen. Then they can take those home with them. Oh, and yes, I know it's not that great that they will end up in a landfill because I'm not thinking that they're all going to recycle those. But at least they are still being used for something good in that way. I don't know. Now that it just created a whole new wormhole in my head of, well, shit, maybe we should be giving those people some kind of biodegradable container. That's a whole other wormhole. But yeah, I just wanted to ask how the progress was going with that. And I've been trying to make sure I'm doing my part too and being more aware and trying to get my kids to use less hot water or take shorter showers and stuff like that, because I learned that was a huge, like your hot water heater is actually one of the biggest energy usage is in your household is reheating hot water. So if you can take shorter or less hot showers, that will help too. So anyways, good check-in. Good job. You want to hear about my badass woman?
Yes, please.
Okay. Do you know who Margaret Hamilton is?
No.
Okay, I'm going to tell you. So Margaret Hamilton is an American computer scientist, systems engineer, and business owner. She's 83, so she's still living with us. And she's a director of software engineering of MIT laboratory. And she developed onboard flight software for NASA's Apollo program.
Cool.
Yep. So she's a computer scientist who was one of the first computer software programmers. In fact, she helped to coin the phrase software engineer to describe the work that she does. She helped write the computer code for the command and lunar modules used on the Apollo missions to the moon in the 1960s and early 70s. She first studied mathematics and philosophy in college. Then she went on to teach high school mathematics in 1958. Then at which point her and her husband decided to move to Boston, and then she began working at MIT, where she began programming software that would predict the weather. And then she did her postgraduate work in meteorology. In the early 1960s, she was involved in a project for the U.S. air defense system. She wrote software for a program to identify enemy aircraft. Then she went on to work on aeronautical technology for NASA while she was at MIT. She led a team that developed software for the guidance and control systems of in-flight command and lunar modules for the Apollo missions. Since there were no teaching software engineering programs at that time, they had to like figure out any of the problems on their own. And she herself specifically concentrated on software that detected system errors and to recover information in case of a computer crash, which actually turned out to be instrumental in the flight of Apollo 11, which was a mission that Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong were on. And so reading about her, I kind of learned what happened is when they were, going in for the landing, so to speak, all these alarms are going off, and it was time. It was like, make the decision, like go or abort. And she had created this software that could kind of detect what was a major problem and what was not, like what was a hardware problem or what was something that was like really important. And her software was saying like it was still okay to keep going. And so they kept going and everything was fine. It turned out to be, something that wasn't, a reason to abort the mission. But if they didn't have that software, they probably would have aborted that mission and then that wouldn't have happened. And so that was all because of her. So,
Wow.
yeah. So I thought, I'm like, she's pretty badass. Like, like out there in a field at that time that was not, mostly male dominated, and she was out there doing her thing. Brilliant woman, obviously. She actually received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama for her work on those missions.
Wow.
Yeah. Back in 2016, she was awarded that. So that is my badass woman, Margaret Hamilton, which I learned.
Well done.
Thank you. I learned about her through Wikipedia and through biography.com, both excellent websites. But if you want to learn more about her, you can check out those websites. And then today, we are going to introduce our listeners to another brilliant woman, Dr. Catlyn Keenan. And she is a professor of philosophy, religious studies, and women and gender studies. And she was also, which we didn't get into, but she's also a Fulbright recipient, which she received that in 2015. She is also an author. She wrote the book Strip, The Making of a The Making of a Feminist. And we spoke to her about sex, gender, consent, feminism. She's brilliant, and she really just kind of opened my eyes to a lot of things. And I'll make a caveat that in the interview, I used the word stripper. And then after we met with her, I started thinking, was that the right word? Because you never know. Like you hear people say dancer, exotic dancer, all these different terms. And so I actually emailed her and asked her, like, was that the proper word that I should be using? And she did say that, yes, it was, that was the word that she chose to use in her book because she did work as a stripper. And she talks about that in the book as she worked her way through her master's degree. And so I just making that a point, I want to say like, hey, I went and I asked because I wanted to make sure in case anybody was like, why are you saying that word? And, it doesn't need to be a dirty word. Feminism is not a dirty word. Stripper's not a dirty word. So I don't know. We all have a lot to learn. And I hope that Catlyn will teach our listeners, I hope they'll get as much out of her as we did because she was brilliant. And so without further ado, let's listen to Catlyn's interview. Hi, Catlyn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're super excited to have you. I think you're super interesting. And I was just telling you, our friend Kay is the one who recommended you, and you blew their mind. And you have now blown mine. I read your book, and I know when Kay came up to me and Kay said, she blew my mind, and I had to go back to her and say, now put me back together. And that's how I kind of feel. I'm just like, oh my gosh. So I really appreciate that they recommended you to us because I think that you're super fascinating. And I think you're going to have a lot of good information for me to learn and also just for our listeners to learn. Can you tell us, just a little bit about yourself starting out, like your name and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Catlyn Keenan. I publish some of my stuff under Catlyn Ladd. So both of my websites, catlynkeenan.com and catlynladd.com. If you want the entire package, you can see both of those websites. I have a PhD in religious studies, and I teach philosophy, religion, women, and gender studies. And I also am trying to write in my spare time. I've been teaching for a long time now. I started teaching straight out of my master's program in 2001 and have been teaching ever since. And let's see, personally, I consider myself a feminist and an activist and a writer and a cook and an animal lover and a motorcycle rider.
Awesome.
That's right. And you've been riding since you were 12. Is that right?
Yes. So my dad taught me to ride when I was 12. And my dad is the first feminist in my life. He turned my mom into a feminist way before I was born. But so I was born into sort of a progressive, activist, politically informed, conscientious family. And so, yeah, motorcycle riding was part of that because he basically wanted his daughter to kick ass.
Yeah.
So
Well, it sounds like you do.
he's like, well, so you need to ride and you need to be able to work on the bike and you need to be able to work on a car and, like be a fully formed human. And so, yeah, he taught me to ride when I was 12. And I've been riding ever since, on and off.
Do you have a bike now?
Yeah.
What do you got?
I have a Yamaha V-Star,
Yes.
which is kind of a road bike. And my partner also rides. And so we got back into riding a few years ago when he said, well, I want to ride a motorcycle. And I said, well, it just so happens I already know how to do that. And so I kind of supported him in pursuing that. And then he started riding and got a bike. And I was like, okay, well, if you're going to have a bike, then I'm going to have a bike. So now we're a motorcycle family again.
And
Well, that's a whole community too.
Oh, yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's badass, you know?
And it's interesting being a woman in that community because most women ride behind men.
Yep.
And so the attention is kind of interesting. And being just a woman on a motorcycle, I am not an idiot, so I wear full gear when I ride. Even though we live in a state where you don't have to wear a helmet, that's insane to me. So I totally do. Yeah. So, I'm fully geared. And so it's not like I'm riding around in Daisy Dukes and no helmet. So it's interesting, the reactions that I get even on the street, just from like passersby. There's a lot of what I would consider street harassment that happens.
Really?
And then the funniest thing is a lot of times, like I'll be sitting in a gas station and I won't take off my gear. Whoops, sorry. Hit the mic. I won't take off my gear when I'm at the gas station and men will approach me and want to talk to me. And a lot of times they'll use the bike as the sort of the opening, but then they'll ask me out. And they can't even see me. Like I'm in full helmet, full gear. Like they can't even see what I look like. And so that's interesting.
That is interesting. It's interesting that you say about like, do they just people yelling out their cars at you? And,
yeah, and it's not just men. So sometimes women will yell at me too. Sort of like encouraging. Like,
okay.
yeah, way to go, stuff like that. Which, for the record, don't ever do that to a
because it's
motorcycle.
pretty distracting, right?
Because when somebody yells at me, I assume that they've seen something I haven't seen and
Yes.
I'm about to die. So, don't ever do that.
Maybe come to you once you've stopped and be like, hey, you're badass. Good
right,
job.
like, well done. That's fine. But yeah, don't yell at a motorcyclist in traffic.
That's good. Yeah, that's a good PSA there.
So I want to know more about your dad.
Yeah.
He sounds like an amazing man, just right off from, talking about he was your first feminist in your life. I mean, what did that look like? What does that mean to you? And is he still here with us today? Are you close with him? I'd love to hear about that. I'm close with my dad, so when I hear something like that.
Yeah, I'm close with both my parents. Yeah. And so my dad is a very interesting person. He comes from a very impoverished background, Southern background. And he put himself through college by basically what he would do is he would buy cars and motorcycles and fix them up and sell them to get tuition money. And then he would pay for a semester and then take a semester off. So it took him a long time to get through college because he had to do it that way. Even in the 1960s when college was a lot cheaper. That's how he went about it. And then he came up for the draft for the Vietnam War. And he had a low draft number. And he didn't believe in the military-industrial complex. So he had met my mom by that point, And they had a very serious conversation about leaving the country. But at that point, there was no sense that people would be able to return.
Right.
So it was they were viewing it as a permanent solution. And so he decided that if he was going to be drafted into the armed forces, that he was going to do that as an officer. So he went into ROTC and came out as an officer and went into the Air Force. So I actually had a conversation with him fairly recently, within the past, 10 years. And I said, why did you? Like, you're so anti-war. Like, what? And he said, I really wanted to fly fast planes. So that's where I get my adrenaline junkie is from him. And so he did. And he actually never ended up deploying to Vietnam. He was an instructor pilot, so he trained all the pilots who went, but he actually never deployed himself, but he's a veteran. And he and my mom just made really interesting decisions with their life. And so after he got out of the Air Force, he was in real estate for a little while. Then he was like, nope, don't want to be any part of this. Don't have any interest in being part of the rat race. He was the second ranked real estate agent in Phoenix when I was born. And then they gave all of that up and moved to the Ozark Mountains, where I spent most of my childhood on 180 acres in the Ozark Mountains, which is where I learned to ride a motorcycle is in the Ozarks. And so he and my mom have always just made very calculated, but what a lot of people would consider risky decisions. So to give up a career and move to the Ozarks and live off the land. And he did a whole bunch of different things for money over the years, but we didn't actually need a lot of money because everything was paid for outright. We had no mortgage. They put in solar, so we had no electric bill. The only bill we had is a propane bill and a phone line. And so they figured out how they could live a very adventuresome life on very little money. And so, and he and my mom both. My mom graduated from college when she was 19. She graduated high school, she was 16 or 17, and then did college in 2.5 years.
Oh, wow.
And so both of them are just wicked smart. And are sort of conscientious objectors to a lot of the bullshit that's going on in society.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. They live in Arkansas, which is, of course, a pretty conservative place, and they are not conservative, even remotely. And they tell stories about like going to vote for particular progressive issues and feeling like in some way their vote was more important because they were voting against the tide in Arkansas.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm from Texas, and I felt that way before coming. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's important. And my mom has this really powerful story that she shared with me. I was little, and she went to vote, and there was an anti-abortion bill in Arkansas. And she had this, when she went to vote, the person who was handing out the ballots, who was this like old white hillbilly, said something about like, well, there's a killing babies thing on the ballot, or save the babies, or whatever he said to her. And she didn't say anything in response. But she said that when she went into the voting booth and I was playing at her feet, she has this very clear memory of being like, I am voting for me and my daughter, who was in the voting booth with her. Like that kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the environment I was raised in.
That's amazing.
It is.
Yeah.
I have to ask, have you spent time in Boston?
Boston.
Yeah. I heard
6
Wicked
weeks.
Smart.
Oh.
And I was like, oh my gosh.
I've only spent 6 weeks in Boston.
Oh, you picked up Wicked Smart somehow. Or just someone say I only hear Boston people say
That's
it.
funny.
Unless
Wicked
something's
Smart.
wicked. Anyway, yes, that's I just had to know. I had to know. Whenever I hear the accent or someone say wicked.
Question
Go ahead,
for
thanks.
you. So this comes from your book, and so your book is Strip: The Making of a Feminist, and it has the questions in the back. So after you read the book, and it talks about how you never really defined what kind of feminist you are. And do you have a definition of what kind of feminist you are?
It's a complicated question. And so it depends on how you define feminism, right? And so I think that the most basic definition that most people who work in the field of women and gender studies use is that feminism is about equality for all people. And so that's certainly how I define myself. But the recognition that equality is necessary is predicated on the observation that we're not equal. And so in some ways, I'm the sort of feminist who wishes that feminism wasn't necessary.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I think is true for a lot of people. And I hope that one day it won't be necessary. I think we have a long way to go, but
Yeah.
fingers crossed. And so the other thing is, feminism has these different waves. So some people still say we're in the third wave, and some people say we're in the fourth wave, and some people say we're post-feminist or, whatever. And so the other aspect that I'm really sensitive to, that I talk a little bit about in the book, but not in depth, is that there's also really important critiques of feminism from people of color and from trans women, and from basically non-cis, non-heteronormative demographics.
We just had this conversation because Travis brought that up about feminism and this kind of clash with, I guess non-progressive feminism, maybe.
Right.
And so that's interesting that you bring that up.
Right. And so the other part of it is I'm very sensitive to that critique. And I also feel like I'm always learning more. And so I also don't want to be like, I am now woke.
Right. Well, that's
John
what
Donne,
I'm like right here. I'm like, just teach me. I want to know, because I am very much, and especially since we've been doing this podcast, realizing how much of a bubble I am in and how uneducated I am, but how much I want to know. You know what I mean? Because I want everybody to be included, and I want to be respectful of everybody, and I want these certain things, but I also realize that I am very naive. And you talk about privilege in that book, and privilege of being white, of being female, of, being tall, beautiful, all of these different things that different people have to be privileged of. And I realize that I'm in my bubble partially because of certain privileges I have.
Absolutely. So I want to be the sort of feminist who's really sensitive to that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do like, I was telling Corey about how you talk about in there, you have your kind of sex positive progressive feminism, and then there's this radical feminism. And for me, I'm just like, oh, that radical feminism is just almost that it's too harsh and too in your face. And it almost sends this message of, are you really being a feminist because you're kind of hating on certain aspects about women, right? I don't know.
Yeah. So some of the second wave feminists, and part of me understands completely why they were so pissed off. Like, I get that.
Right.
Yeah, I can get pretty pissed off myself. Okay, I get it. But and the other thing about them is that sometimes they would say things intentionally to shock. And it was,
Yeah.
And I also get that. Like, I get that the extreme makes an impression and that sometimes it's a useful tool, right? So I get that. But at the same time, Andrea Dworkin, I think, was the one who said that all heterosexual intercourse is rape. And her point is that in the same way that, let's say, a slave can never consent. So even if the slave says yes, it's not consent because they're a slave.
Right.
That because women are enslaved in a patriarchal society, they can never truly consent either way. That was her point. And I'm like, okay, well, that's a provocative point. But that means I really feel like I should be able to say yes.
Right.
In addition to saying no. And so I use that as a talking point in my women and gender studies class because I think it's a really interesting point of conversation. But I'm with you, whoa. And in some way, to say that I can't consent is to undermine the very freedom that I'm trying to establish for myself in a patriarchal environment. So there is this weird contradiction. And I also think that a lot of people, when they hear the word feminism, that's what they think of like man hating. And she wasn't necessarily hating on men, but she was making a particular point about heterosexual relationships in a patriarchal context. And so that sort of flavor of feminism is what is often in the forefront of people's minds. And what I try to do is I try to say that actually it's not feminism, it's feminisms, and you get to pick.
Right. It's almost like,
that.
shouldn't we have a new word by now? For, like, yeah, I don't know.
I really, really like that because for a long time I had this just idea of what it was, period. And I actually didn't want to use the word because there was just too many contradictions and too many layers. And but for me, myself, yes, women empowerment, I guess, you could call me that, but, so I'm glad to hear that now this plural idea.
Yeah. Well, and, like some people will say, I'm not a feminist, I'm a humanist. So the great scholar, Chimamanda Adichie, has a great comeback to that where she says, okay, yes, it's basically the same as saying that all lives matter. In response to Black Lives Matter, because she says that to use a different word that other than feminist is to overlook or undermine that women have been uniquely targeted in patriarchal contexts. And that doesn't mean that trans women and women of color, like all women. And so she's like, we absolutely have to keep using the word. Why? And actually, to do that responsibly, we have to acknowledge the baggage that the term has.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's currently where I am in my thinking on that. It might change, but that's where I am right now.
Well, and you have the right to
Right.
and hopefully we all do. That's part of growing as humans, right? Is that we have this ability to change our minds and our beliefs, and that's okay, right?
Right.
And it's so interesting. It's just like, why not? Why not learn more about this? Why not come together? And I like what you said about feminist, humanist. I like that too. I have a bunch of questions. Do you have questions?
I do. Well, I think I want to get into a little bit. I don't want this to all be about this. I want this just to be about you as this whole person. But part of your writing in this book and part of your education into getting your views maybe around feminism is that you did work as a stripper for 5 years. Is that correct? To help pay your way through college.
Correct.
And some people hear that and they automatically have these different thoughts, right? From all different kinds. So you can go from one extreme to the other, just like with anything else. And I read your book and I loved in the back, towards the end, and you talk about you may see certain aspects, you left some of these stories open-ended, and some of these you may see abuse in or exploitation, and some of them you see empowerment and liberation. And if you did your job well, you see both. And I will tell you did your job well for me, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Because I definitely saw both. There were times in reading this book that I felt, sad for maybe the stripper that you were talking about, or sad for the client that you were talking about, the man coming in and his reasons and his needs for certain things in the fantasy that he was living in. And then I also felt the liberation and the empowerment from your point of view and your just confidence. And for me, I'm not that. I'm trying to work on that myself. But for me, I was like, oh, I just felt that. And I felt so just happiness for you and your ability to have that empowerment and that self-love and that knowledge about yourself. So can you, I guess, if you don't mind getting into that a little bit, unless Corey has another question before we
No, I have a bunch of other questions. But I must say, I follow this woman. Her name, she goes by Lux ATL on Instagram. I've been following her for a long time. I don't even know how I bumped into her, but I love her. And her tagline is stripper with a PhD. And this woman is badass. She is just so when Lisa told me that she found a stripper with a PhD and then to hear women in gender studies and philosophy and really, I mean, I was so excited. So yes, please, I'd love to open the box and hear about that.
Yeah. So I made the decision to become a stripper. I talk about it in the book. I needed to make money fast. And I, especially at the time, in my late teens, actually 19, certainly fit the stereotype of beauty for the United States. Social construction that it is, I was like, I may as well take advantage of this. And there was definitely a very intentional realization that if society was going to objectify me, I may as well profit from it. And people obviously are going to have mixed reactions to that, which is fine. That's the decision I made.
I think it's brilliant.
And, and women who are objectified, which is almost every woman in some way, shape, or form, they make different decisions in response to that experience. And so that was mine. I was like, you know what? If I can get paid thousands of dollars for appearing naked in public, like, come on. Sure, absolutely. I'm going to expensive schools. And so but at the same time, I went into that, you can never become a stripper and know exactly what you're getting into. And so, which is true for a lot of things in life, I guess, but I learned a lot that I didn't expect to learn. And I feel like in some ways the strip club is like a microcosm, like a condensed version of wider society where you see it all in a very obvious way. And so in some ways I learned so much about our society. I also learned how to politic, like how to communicate with different types of people. And those skills have just continued to serve me, which is pretty cool. But the other thing that really bugs me is, so Adichie, who's one of my heroes, Adichie also talks about the problem of a single story or a single narrative. And a lot of times around stripping, there is a single narrative. And that's just not true. And it's another way of homogenizing a largely female experience. There are male strippers, there are trans strippers, but the vast majority of strippers are cisgender females on a variety of sexual orientations. And so it was interesting to be in an environment and be, well, now labeled stripper, in a way that society perceives in a particular way. So I hear it all the time. Like I was just on social media the other day, and this woman was sharing some concerns about her college-age daughter who had graduated from college but was sort of finding herself at loose ends. And she said, I hope she doesn't end up on a stripper pole. And I was like, okay, that might not be a bad thing for her, or the assumption, that strippers are, that they aren't educated, and that they're not pursuing an education. And a lot of the women I worked with over the years were doing the same thing I was, which was paying for school. And obviously they had various degrees of success. It's also really unusual for people in the United States to have a PhD. 2% of Americans have a PhD. And so I was not expecting all of my coworkers to go out and get PhDs, but they were pursuing a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree, or, in some way making an investment in their future with the money they were earning. And so I would say that is the vast majority of strippers in the United States are women who are taking advantage of the economic opportunity to improve their lives in some way. And then there are sort of the extremes. And on the opposite extreme are the strippers who are trafficked and intentionally addicted to drugs and pimped out. And I mean, that is absolutely a reality.
Which is politicized, and that's what we see.
Exactly.
So,
and so the assumption is that that's all strippers. And that's just not true. But I also think that narrative is another way of oppressing women, because by saying that all women have been taken advantage of because we're poor, weak little, that need to be protected, that's part of that same patriarchal narrative, by saying that these women have been exploited and that they're not making free choices. Because the vast majority of what I witnessed was women who were making very free choices with their eyes open. They knew what they were doing. And to say that they didn't is another way of undermining their autonomy and integrity.
I love it. I love that you wrote this book, and I love that you say all those things that you just said in this book, and that I was reading it and realizing that you weren't saying, and you even say it, like, you're not speaking for everyone, but this was your journey and what you saw and your experience. And for me, I think that's much more powerful than some, person that's researching it and they're not actually they haven't lived it. They don't know. And you're saying there are all different kinds, right? There's the extreme, like you just talked about. There's your experience, and then there's all the middle too.
Yes.
And so I think it's really important to remember.
And I think it's important that that more women who did what you did are talking about it, because that is going to change this stigma, whatever it is, of this idea. And that this woman that I mentioned earlier, she changed my idea. I always was very attracted to stripping in general. I think it's a beautiful art, one. And I thought would be brilliant. I thought, I can't dance. I'm just not, I can dance naked in my, in front of my mirror.
Right.
But I just, up on stage, I don't know. I've never tried it. Maybe I could.
Maybe you could.
I always have admired the women who could get up on stage and do that. And I've known, besides that woman, and now there was a girlfriend of mine too, that she worked in a club in college, and I was envious. I was like, that is so smart. And, she doesn't do it anymore. She has 2 degrees, she's traveling the world. And so this is just inspiring. And, I'm looking at your website as we're talking about, and I love that you call yourself an eclectic academic. I love that. And how cool, that you're interested in religion, sexualities, the paranormal, violence, philosophy, and feminism. This is really great to chat with you. And I'm already, I have so many questions. And to go off what we were just talking about, the word sex work, what does that mean, really? What is that?
That's a great question. So when I teach sexuality classes, that's actually a question I start with, is I say, what is sex? Define that word for me.
Yeah.
And all the students giggle. And then I start really digging into that. What really actually are we talking about? And so the definition of sex work is anyone who profits off of any element of their sexuality. So that can go from phone sex workers or webcam girls, all the way to prostitution, right? So it runs the entire gamut and includes, peep shows. It includes strip clubs, and all strip clubs are not created equal. There's a gazillion different types of strip clubs. And then it goes into prostitution, and they're all different varieties of prostitution as well. So, but it's a fascinating question, because our entire idea of what is sexual is a social construct, right? And so, in some cultures, what parts of the body are sexualized varies widely. And so, in India, it's shoulders. And so, so all of the women in India, everyone from little girls to grandmothers, their midriffs are all bare, but their shoulders are always covered. Huh. If they're not, it's scandalous. And so, what we sexualize is totally a social construct. And so, what is considered sexual determines then what is considered sex work. I would say that we have a fairly standard definition worldwide at this point, but largely due to globalization. And so, I think about prostitutes in the 19th century who charged photographers to take pictures of their ankles, things like that. And so, yeah, it's an interesting question of what is sex work, and it varies by time and place.
No, I had no idea. I didn't even consider that it, over in India or all over the world, it's different. And I have to ask, gender studies. I mean, that's a whole other thing, right? So I have questions. Do we know how many different genders there are right now? Or how does that defined? I mean, that's kind of a naive question even, because I guess when we're talking about, okay, male and female.
Sure.
Right. We're very aware of that. And so now is society, trans people, transgender people, how is that coming into play? All of these changes, I guess this is what I'm asking. How are all these changes that are happening changing the world of gender studies?
Oh, sure. So women in gender studies is probably the newest academic discipline. It started in the early 1970s. And so it's a new discipline in the grand scheme of things. Philosophy is the oldest discipline in the world, started at least 3,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I teach on both ends of that, the oldest and the newest. And so gender studies is constantly shifting, which is one of the things that makes it a really exciting field. And the first realization that people who are interested in this came to before the development of the field as an academic discipline is that a lot of our gender and sexuality is socially constructed. And so the first sort of distinction that was made was between the social construction and the biology. So when we talk about biology, we talk about sex. So male, female, and intersex is usually the way that biologists would approach sex on a physical level, which means that there's 3 sexes. However, intersex itself is a category with a ton of variation. And so, and I'm only talking biology here. I'm not talking anything else right now. Purely biologically, there are, oh man, I don't even know, 10 common types of intersexuality.
Really?
And so I think the statistic is 1.7% of humans have some form of intersexuality. Huh. That's almost 2 out of every 100.
And how could that look?
Widely varied.
Really?
And so there is, like, for example, one form of intersexuality that is completely indiscernible, including like physical exams, like indiscernible without I don't even know what sort of invasive tests, is that there's a range of hormones that's determined as normal for both male and female. And if you're outside of that normal range, that's a form of intersexuality. Oh. But everything could be look and be functioning according to your understanding of your own sex.
So you could be intersex and you may not even know.
You could be intersex and may not even know. Huh. Usually there will be some signs around puberty where somebody won't enter puberty quite according to the normal, but they may or may not have a blood test. Like a woman may start, or a person who understands themselves as a biological woman may start menstruating way late or something like that. But then if menstruation does ultimately begin, medical field would say everything's progressing normally. But it could be due to, a slight hormone difference or something like that. So that's like one end of the spectrum. And then it goes into, so we think of biological sex as being like XX and XY chromosomes. There are all sorts of chromosome anomalies. So there can be XXY. That results in pretty severe mental and physical handicaps that go along with it. So that one's pretty obvious. Yeah. There's a pretty common one where a person will present as a biological female. And by that, I mean that if you gave her a pelvic exam, she would have a vulva and a vagina and a cervix and all of that stuff. She won't have ovaries, though. And instead of having ovaries, she has undistended testes. So when she hits puberty, women who have this, and most of them do understand themselves as women, they won't menstruate. They don't ovulate, so they don't menstruate. They're typically pretty tall and thin, so small breasts, tall, thin, beautiful people by our current standards. And so the only way to determine that is that the woman won't start menstruating. Usually that results in an MRI, at which point the lack of ovaries will be discovered.
Wow.
And usually the solution to that is to actually remove the undescended testes because they're prone to tumors. So to take them out. And then she lives the rest of her life as a normal person, however that looks for that individual. And so that is actually pretty common.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, like I had a student a few years ago who had that condition. And she had no idea. And then she never started menstruating. So at some point they were like, maybe we should figure out what's going on here. And that's when they discovered it. And she was like, I feel like a woman, except she doesn't menstruate. So she doesn't have that very common female experience. So she was a little bit like, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. But other than that, she was like, yeah, I'm a girl. But yeah. And so it can look a wide variety of different ways.
Yeah. So are doctors, specialists in this study, scientists, are they recognizing, so we talked about male, female, and intersex. Are they starting to recognize gay, straight, are they using words like gay, straight, transgender? I don't know any of the other ones.
Then
right
that
off the
wouldn't
top
be
of my head.
that wouldn't be speaking from biology standpoint.
Right. So that's gender. So we've been talking about sex. Gender is the social construct.
Thanks for talking to me about this.
Sure.
I have so many questions.
So gender is the social construct. So cisgender and transgender, for example, is when your understanding of yourself as a person doesn't match your biology, you would be considered trans. But I, for example, am cisgender because I'm a biological female, as far as I know. Never actually had it tested, but I assume I am. I'm a biological female who presents and feels like a biological female. So I'm cisgender. That, however, is all sort of part of our social construct. And the way that society understands that, again, varies widely by time and place. And so many societies, not just now, but throughout history, have considered there to be three genders. They didn't always make the distinction between sex and gender the way that we do in the academic discipline now, but they had, like Nepal, for example, recognized a third gender as part of its census data over a decade ago now, where people could basically choose not male or female. And so there was that's not a biological category. That was just the way that they understand and experience their own existence and was an option, became an option. And more societies are starting to do that. Now, the leader in this field in the United States at any rate, is a bioethicist out of Boston University named Anne Fausto Sterling. And so if you really want to dig into the nitty-gritty of this, she's the person I would recommend. She says that there are at least 5 and maybe as many as 7 biological sexes, and then they present in a wide variety of gender expressions. And we haven't even talked about sexual orientation, right? So I could be a transgender woman who's also a lesbian.
Yeah.
So there are lots of different expressions. Now, I will say that it's kind of exciting time to be in the field right now, because in the Western world, we're really talking about this stuff and we're really interested, and there's a lot of activism around it. And so people are creating new categories to explain their own existence and their own experience. And what I expect is over the next, 4 or 5 generations, 80 to 100 years, those categories will sort of coalesce into some standard language, is usually what happens when I'm being a sociologist right now in the study of societies. And so I expect that will start to happen. But right now, it's sort of this explosion of freedom of expression, which is really cool and really exciting. And it's giving us a much more comprehensive view about the multiplicity of stories that there are out there in the world.
And you mentioned experience. So like being a transgender female who's a lesbian. The word experience. So it's not biological. Is it psychological? Or is it biological? And do we even know?
We don't know. We don't know. And
It's
so
a mystery.
It is a
right?
mystery. And so
It's so
the best
fascinating.
guess that we have right now is that it's a combination of biology and society. And so it is very clear from our study of history that there have always been individuals who did not clearly adhere to the male-female dualism. But the way that they understood and expressed their experience is deeply rooted in culture. And so the best example of this, and it's a tired example, but it illustrates the point really well, is the ancient Greek practice of homosexuality. We didn't even have the word homosexuality until less than 200 years ago. So to say that the Greeks were homosexual is a complete misnomer.
Yeah.
And even today, the word homosexual, or whatever its linguistic equivalent is in the local language, is a social construct. And there's an impulse to be like, okay, if you like to sleep with the same sex of people as you are, you're a homosexual. And not really, no, not necessarily. It's much more complicated than that. And so like, there are a lot of cultures, particularly in South America, some in Africa, where the person is only men can be homosexual. And the only men who are homosexual are the ones who are penetrated by another man. The penetrator is not homosexual. Women, because they don't have a penis to penetrate with, we don't even talk about them. So they can be doing whatever with whoever, and they're all heterosexual. And so, even those categories that in the United States, especially because of the politics that we have going on in the United States, are considered these like really rigid. They're really not. They're totally socially constructed. And let me say one thing about that. A lot of times when people, not just me, say that something is socially constructed, there's an assumption that it somehow isn't real. That is not what I am saying. And in fact, the social constructs that we have are some of the most real things. But I think that recognizing that something is a social construct is liberating, because it allows us to recognize that if a social construct is damaging, that we can change it.
I love that.
And so I think that's a really important point that I always like to make.
In your classes for these studies, are you teaching people about all the different variations of gender and sexuality in these classes? And are you teaching them from strictly like a educational purpose, or does it lean one way or the other, as saying like, you should accept this is okay, don't be scared of this, all of those kinds of things? Or is it like just strictly informational? This is how people are, this is what this person does and that person does, or how's that work? How does that look?
So as an employee in a state-funded institution, I am legally prohibited from advocating for any positions.
Yeah, that's what
political or
So
otherwise.
you have to be careful with that then, right? Or is it, are you
Yeah.
kind of,
I don't know.
you're good at it?
I mean, educators get pretty good at it. And educators take different positions on this too. And so some educators they will say, in order to be absolutely clear, I am going to list my own biases. So that a student can say, okay, and use that as a filter. Other educators will say, okay, I acknowledge that I have biases. I don't want to tell you what they are, because my words as the talking head in front of the class have a particular amount of power, and I don't want you to influence you with my perspectives. I want you to form your own perspectives. And at the end of the semester, you're welcome to ask me whatever you want, but I'm going to try to be as objective as possible. So there's a sort of two approaches.
I really love that this is becoming such a mainstream thing and being talked about, and people are getting educated, because it doesn't matter. Like, if you want to, take that up, yourself, fine. If you don't, fine. If you think it's wrong or if it's right, whatever, you still need to know. We all still need to know about these things. And for me, I have two young boys, and when they were in elementary school, they wanted to have a play come in to teach them about being transgender because they were opening transgender bathrooms. And I was totally on board with this. Like, yes, let's do this. But some parents, man, they threw the biggest fit, and we were getting emails from the principal. And I can't imagine being an educator and needing to do these things. And then you have these people pulling, and I'm like, why would you not want your children to know? Like, this is the world we're living in. Things are changing. These are people too. They're coming to the school, and you don't know, your child could be one of those people someday. You don't know that yet. And it just seemed like this closed-mindedness of, I don't want to even know, like, that's not being very beneficial to anyone, I don't feel like. So I really appreciate that these studies are happening.
This is why I teach in college and not at primary school.
I can't imagine. Yeah, it must be very hard to be in primary. I felt for our principal, and I was like, oh, because she's just trying to do the best, and
Right.
And our children need to know, like, you want your kid to go to school, like these other kids are coming to the school, so shouldn't they know about this?
I will say that it's not uncommon for me to have students who share with me that they really wish that they had had a different type of education in primary school.
Yeah.
And like, I've definitely had students say some variety of, why am I just now learning about this?
That's how I feel about myself.
Yeah. And
Really?
so, and I say, well, better now than never.
Right.
But there's a lot, humans, so this is me being philosophic. So humans, there's a great paradox in human existence. And that is that our survival has depended upon our ability to adapt very quickly to changing circumstances. Ironically, we're terrified of change. Yeah. And so anything that is new or different or unfamiliar sends us into a panic. And that's what these parents are feeling. It's fear, that deep-seated fear of the unknown and of difference. And I think it's also, especially from a parent's perspective, there's also a fear that's probably pretty unconscious that you may have raised your children wrong. Mm-hmm. You may have screwed it up. And if suddenly the school is saying, this is what we want to do, and that sparks that fear response in you, and certainly not for all people, but there may be that sense of like, oh, I'm not doing it right. And that will shut people down faster than anything, because all of your defenses come up. And I don't have a solution to that problem. So please work one out and tell me.
Somebody out there, find the solution.
Because I don't have it. I don't have the answer to that.
I have a question about, so with you being in the academic world, do you ever feel like people would just say anything or try to shame you for the way that you got there? Or is everybody pretty open-minded and kind? And
they haven't said it to my face.
And I would think that your merits speak for themselves, because you're a very bright, intelligent woman who knows what they're talking, what you're talking about. So does that matter? Like,
I mean, I will say, I waited to publish this book until after I was tenured.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's that. And
she's a very smart
but
woman.
You know what? You're laying this groundwork for somebody else that can come up behind you that doesn't have to wait till they're tenured to say that, right?
And in no way is that a disparaging comment about any of my colleagues. And so I wasn't worried about any individual targeting me or anything like that. It was one of those political decisions that I made, and just, I don't know, to be on the safe side. And yeah, I did want to build up a certain degree of professional capital as well as job security. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the other part of it is that I do want to lay the groundwork so that other people won't have to make that decision. And I will say that the response from my colleagues has been just awesome. I mean, very, very generous. They all supported me by buying the book and giving it to all their friends and coming to my book reads and like all the stuff, and which is just awesome. And so I felt very supported. But I did wait until after I was tenured.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would have done the same thing.
Yep.
You know?
And I love in the book, the chapter, I just want to say this and we're starting to wrap up here soon, but where you meet your husband.
Oh,
He sounds amazing and lovely. And I was like, as soon as you like started going to him, like, is she going to marry? I was like hooked. And like, is she going to marry this guy? Like,
yep. Yeah, we celebrated 20 years in August.
That's
Wow,
congratulations.
Oh my gosh. So for our listeners who haven't read the book, and we highly recommend that you do get the book.
We're going to put the links on our website. and everything
Could
too.
you just give us a tiny little synopsis of how you met your husband or how that played out, or would it be spoiler?
Well, I can certainly summarize it.
Yes, summarize.
Yeah. So, when you're getting to know people, especially as a couple, and you say, well, how did you meet? That's always an interesting question to navigate. And I always respond to that question by saying, I picked him up in a bar. Unless I want to get into it. Now that I published the book, I say, well, I published a book that you could go buy. And you too could know the entire story. But yeah, I mean, so I met him in the strip club, and he had come in with a couple of friends. They had never been to a strip club before, and it was totally that like young dude, like rite of passage kind of thing where they're sitting around and they're like, we're old enough to get in a strip club. We've never done that. And so they did. And that's where I met him. And it was that, I don't know, it was in many ways a pretty typical just sort of attraction where I was initially just attracted to him because he's kind of hot.
Yeah, your description of him, I'm like, oh yeah, he sounds hot.
Yeah, he's totally hot. I mean, the entire club, and this will embarrass the hell out of him, but I don't care. The entire club kind of went aflutter over him, which I kind of talk about a little bit. But yeah, all of the girls were like, whoa. And so anyway, and then I started talking to him because I'm assertive like that. And then he turned out to be this really cool person who is smart and funny and thoughtful and totally a feminist and will own it, including in front of other men, which is pretty awesome. And and so then I was in no way, shape, or form looking for a relationship at all. But then I just really liked him, and then he really liked me, and then we just really liked each other, and we've been together ever since.
That's great.
I love
it.
I have one quick question. Going back to the feminism topic before we start wrapping up here, because I don't know a lot about. I'm just like I said. I'm just opening my eyes to a lot of things and learning, and I'm curious to know, because I feel like certain types of feminism are women. Some people, I should say, may shame other people for how they are their brand of feminism. And I'll just use this as an example. I love Dolly Parton. There is a podcast I listen to, and they were talking about her and how she didn't like that word. She didn't necessarily want to be called that, but people are like, but you are in a way. And back from the 9 to 5 movie, and you've got Lily Tomlin and you've got Jane Fonda, who are way out there on the other side,
getting arrested,
being total activists.
Yeah,
like they're
Jane Fonda keeps getting arrested.
They are really out there in their activism. And then you have somebody who is in a way their own feminist and bringing, body positivity, plastic surgery, all of these different things, and doing her own thing, but she's not in your face, and she's not out there getting arrested. and so it's like navigating these two is there a right way to be a feminist in your opinion? Or is it just like do what you want and what you're comfortable with and what makes you happy? And, I'm just curious what people think about that is, if there's a right way to be, like, do you have to be out there in the front lines to be a feminist?
No. I think my particular position, but I'm not claiming it for everyone.
Yeah.
My position that may not be right for everyone, and I'm open to having that conversation, is that we do need to claim the word. Because it has been demonized by largely conservative white men, and I want to reclaim that word.
Right.
The other thing that just thrills me to no end is seeing men claiming that word. So I go to the women's marches, and I'm always so inspired by all the men there who are like, I'm a feminist. I'm here, like equality is good for everyone, like that kind of thing. So I really encourage people to embrace that word, largely because it provides an opportunity to educate people who might push back against you. And so they're like, well, are you a man hater? And you can say, well, how do you define feminism? And if they say, man hating, whatever, blah, 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 you can say, actually, that's not at all what it is. We encourage men to be feminists, and here's why. But at the same time, you have to be comfortable having that conversation in order to, you have to be prepared for that. The other thing is that there are so many feminist actions that you can do without getting arrested.
Right.
And so, like, raising boys is
yeah.
huge
That's what I'm trying to do right now.
People need to be activists.
I have 2 boys and I'm trying. And we make a good, what I do have to say, I do believe my husband is a feminist. We make a point of saying, and if they ever notice, because I don't have a normal job, I own my own little business, I don't make the bulk of the money. And my kids have made a comment about that here and there. And we're like, he will shut that down in a heartbeat. Like,
right.
No. We're a family, we're a unit, and we're all in this together. And I'm no better or anything because I make more money. And your mom's no better because she does more of this. Like, we're in this at a partnership. And we had this sex talk, going off on a tangent, the other day with my son, because we try to talk about sex. He's only 13, but we're out there. We're starting.
Oh, yeah.
We're like starting. And we were talking about it. And then I started talking about consent and and my husband was like, I don't know that we have to go there yet. And
Yes,
I
you
said,
do.
yes, we do. I was like, especially because consent can be so confusing for a young girl. And being able to read their body language and being able to see, are they saying yes, but their body is saying no? And why are they saying yes? Do they saying yes because they're afraid they're going to lose me? And I had that talk with my son. And I said, sometimes girls will do things with people that they care about that maybe they're not ready to do because they think you're going to leave them and you're not going to like them. And so you need to be aware of that. So I'm trying.
Well, and
trying.
that right there is one of the most practical and important elements of feminism, because in some way we're talking about equality, right? But we don't live in an equal world. And unfortunately and unfairly, the burden in heterosexual relationships falls to the male.
Yeah.
Because women are conditioned to be pleasing and to say yes. And so that puts men in the completely unfair but very real position of having to read a woman's mind, which is stupid.
Yeah.
And yet
It's just the truth.
And so, like, one of the most powerful sexual experiences that I ever had was this was not my first time having sex. Let me just put it that way. It was a partner who, the first time we had sex, he asked for me to say the word yes. Nothing else would do. And I had never actually had to say yes before in that way. I was used to men reading my mind. And he wanted verbal consent. And what was surprising to me is how difficult it was for me to say yes. I wanted to have sex with him. He was beautiful and sexy as hell. And but when it got to that point, I felt like saying yes would make me a slut.
Isn't that so interesting? I get that. Yeah.
And so even having sex, it was weird. Like, having sex with him wouldn't make me a slut, but saying I wanted to have sex with him would. And that was a great moment for me where I was like, okay, there's some patriarchal bullshit in my head right here. And there it is. Now it's very visible.
Wow.
And so I said yes to him. And then reflecting back on it, I so applaud that guy for actually getting verbal consent. And he wasn't weird about it. It was actually really sexy. Like, he wanted to be very clear that we were both in this together. And nothing is sexier than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was the other thing too, is I was like, wow, consent is super sexy.
I mean, I feel like we could go on to a whole other hour talking about this topic.
A couple of
and
hours.
especially like for me, and I, it's all these things I have to think about, and it's very hard raising children and making sure and thinking about it from both sides of being a woman, and then now I'm raising young, what will be young men and what will be men, and hopefully be good men, and how do I do that right? And then also realizing what you say that I don't want to ever say that, that women have it the worst and or whatever. Like men have stuff too.
Yeah.
And it's very real and they get treated very poorly. And there are other issues that we could talk about for men as well. I think it goes both ways.
Absolutely.
I'm so stuck on consent is so sexy. It's so true.
It's so sexy.
I'd never thought, but it is.
That should be a new slogan. We need to make some bumper stickers.
It is.
Well, and a lot of what we see in popular culture is this sort of like that what's sexy is like spontaneity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where, you suddenly rip your clothes off on the kitchen counter, which don't get me wrong, that can be super sexy.
Sure.
But only if you've established consent first.
Right.
And so consent is incredibly sexy.
Yes.
But we have very few role models that actually show that.
Exactly. Right. Yes.
But
that's
what's sexier than having sex with someone is into you?
Yes.
Like,
Right.
hello.
Yes. Yes.
Right. Because isn't that what you want?
I'm
you
thinking
want
of
that
some
person to be
instances.
into you.
Right.
And like you said, that role model part, people think, oh, it looks like this. But no. Wait,
No.
There's.
Well, and consent, I mean, it's more than just saying yes. It's also being like, okay, have we been tested? What are we doing about contraception? Like that. But then once you have that conversation, you are now free to experience real pleasure.
Yes.
And you can't get to that level of pleasure without having that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But the conversation is often deemed incredibly unsexy, and we don't have any role models. Like you have this like vision of people sitting down across the table. Okay, so right. Do you sign on the dotted line? Like, no, that conversation can actually be part of foreplay, and it can be incredibly charged.
Yes.
It can be a total turn on.
Yeah, hear that, Hollywood, make the movies.
Back and talk all about that, because that's a whole other world that, just like you said, when we get past that, it's not even getting past it when it's discussed or whatever. It's just this whole other world and you can feel comfortable and you can really start to open up and experience real great pleasure.
Right.
And like, oh,
like when we think about good
I never
sex,
knew until I met that man over there. So thank you. But I just never knew for years, and for so many partners, I just didn't know.
Right. And so when we raise boys, we want them to become the men who allow women to have that experience.
Yeah.
Assuming
All right, I'm going to have to teach my boys, like, get ready.
Yeah.
The conversations are coming.
This is such a great conversation. This was so good. This was great.
Yes. Thank you so much, Catlyn, for coming on here.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, seriously, I could talk to you for so much longer. You can come on here and teach us a class. I don't know. But it was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Yes, thank you so much for coming on. And if there are listeners out there that would like to find out more about you or get in touch with you, where can they find you?
So I have two websites because I write under two different names, or I work under two different names. So Catlyn is spelled Catlyn, Keenan, KEENAN.com, and then Catlyn Ladd, LADD.com. And so the Catlyn Ladd website has more of my writing, fiction, nonfiction work, and then Catlyn Keenan is my more academic website with my blog that I should publish more on, but at any rate, with my blog and my academic work and my CV and all that good stuff.
Great.
And we'll
I
put
already
those-
grabbed
yeah.
those links. Those will be on our website for our listeners out there. And that's a wrap.
If you have an interesting story, something funny, something sad, something you want the world to know, please email us. We want you to share your experiences with us. We'll take these, we'll collect them, we'll do some episodes sometimes where we'll read them. So if you want to be anonymous, please just let us know. We won't read your name. If you want your name read, then we will. But send us those stories, comments to info@herturntotalkpodcast.com. And we also ask, if you like what you're hearing, please rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you.